Two neighbors, two thrones, one ocean of oil beneath their feet. For decades, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates sat side by side at the same table, the most powerful energy partners on earth, moving in sync, protecting each other's interests, smiling for the same cameras. The world looked at the Gulf and saw a united bloc, a wall of petropower that no outsider dared challenge. But that wall has a crack in it now, and the crack is getting wider every single day. Right now, as you watch this, Saudi Arabia is pumping more oil into global markets than it has in years. Not because the world needs more oil, not because prices are good, not because it makes financial sense for Riyadh. In fact, the IMF says Saudi Arabia needs oil at around $92 a barrel just to balance its own budget. But in early 2025, oil prices crashed below $60. Saudi Arabia's first quarter deficit for 2025 alone hit $15.6 billion, over half of the full-year deficit they had planned for. Goldman Sachs warned the full-year deficit could explode to $67 billion if prices stay this low. So Saudi Arabia is pumping more oil and losing money doing it. That is not an accident. That is a message. And the message is being sent directly to its neighbor, the UAE. This is the geography of the oil war. And to understand it, you need to go deeper than pipelines and price charts. You need to understand geography, ambition, pride, and the most dangerous kind of rivalry, one between people who used to be friends. Let's start with the map, because geography in this story is everything. Saudi Arabia is the largest country in the Middle East, about 2 million square kilometers of mostly desert. It sits at the center of the Arabian Peninsula like a giant anchor. It borders 8 countries and 2 seas, and directly on its southeastern corner, almost like a small shadow attached to a large body, sits the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is tiny by comparison. It is roughly the size of the state of Maine in the United States. 7 emirates, stitched together. Abu Dhabi is the capital, the powerhouse, the oil chest. Dubai is the glamour, the skyscraper city, the airport that handled over 86 million international passengers in 2023, making it the busiest international airport on the planet. Together, Abu Dhabi and Dubai created a financial, logistical, and cultural machine that punches so far above its weight that it became the headquarters of 76% of all multinational companies operating in the Middle East. 76% in a country the size of Maine. That single number tells you everything about why Saudi Arabia is now at war with its neighbor. Because for 30 years, Saudi Arabia generated the oil revenues that bankrolled the region, but it was the UAE, specifically Dubai, that captured all the value. The headquarters, the deal-making rooms, the consulting fees, the legal structures, the financial flows, the executive talent, all of it pooled in the UAE while Saudi Arabia was still seen as the place where the money came from, not the place where the money was managed. That was the arrangement, and for decades, Riyadh tolerated it. Then came Mohammed bin Salman. In 2016, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, known almost universally as MBS, launched Vision 2030. On the surface, it was an economic diversification plan. Get away from oil, build tourism, develop entertainment, attract global investment. All of this is true and real. The tool they built to achieve this was called the Regional Headquarters Program. From January 1st, 2024, the rule became ironclad. If a multinational company wanted to do business with the Saudi government, one of the largest public sector clients in the world, the company had to relocate its regional headquarters to Riyadh, not maintain a small office, not register a subsidiary, actually move the regional headquarters. And the incentives were dramatic. 0 corporate income tax, 0 withholding tax for an extended period. Against the backdrop of Saudi Arabia's standard 20% corporate tax rate for foreign companies, they were essentially offering companies a no-tax haven inside the world's largest oil economy. The result was staggering. In October 2024, 540 multinational companies had set up regional headquarters in Riyadh. By October 2025, that number had climbed to 675. Companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, PepsiCo, Unilever, Siemens, PwC, Deloitte, and most recently BlackRock, which announced plans to launch its Riyadh investment management platform as part of the largest sovereign investment presence in the kingdom's history. These were not small offices with a nameplate on the door. These were decision-making centers, the places where deals get structured, where regional strategy is made, where the valuable work happens. And when those centers move, they bring lawyers, consultants, auditors, bankers, and their families with them. From the UAE side, this was no longer healthy competition. This was an extraction, a deliberate government-engineered pulling of the region's economic center toward Riyadh. Dubai had spent 3 decades building the infrastructure, the reputation, the trust, and the systems that made it a world-class business hub. And now, by changing a procurement rule, Riyadh was beginning to hollow it out. Dubai International Airport was the world's busiest international hub. Saudi Arabia responded by announcing the King Salman International Airport in Riyadh, projected to handle 120 million passengers annually by 2030. That would not just match Dubai, it would eclipse it. In construction, the competition became almost theatrical. The UAE has the Burj Khalifa, still the tallest building in the world. Saudi Arabia resumed construction on the Jeddah Tower, designed to surpass it upon completion. At sea, Dubai's Jebel Ali port handled 15.7 million shipping containers in 2023. It can endure $60 oil. It has done it before. The UAE, with its more diversified economy, has a lower fiscal break-even price, estimated between $65 and $75 per barrel. On paper, the UAE should be more comfortable with lower oil prices. But here is the critical geography. When Saudi Arabia floods the market with cheaper oil, it is not just competing with the UAE for price, it is competing for the same customers, and specifically, the Asian customers that the UAE has built long-term relationships with. China, Japan, South Korea, and India, the biggest oil consumers in Asia, are not loyal to any flag. They buy from whoever gives them the best price and the most reliability. Every barrel of Saudi oil that lands in a Chinese refinery at a discount is one less barrel the UAE can sell at a premium. The UAE's oil revenue advantage shrinks not just because of the price, but because of the volume competition in markets the UAE thought were secured. And then came December 2025, and the war stopped being only economic. On December 30th, 2025, Saudi Arabia launched airstrikes on the southern Yemeni port of Mukalla. The target was 2 ships that had arrived from the UAE's port of Fujairah, carrying what Saudi officials described as weapons and armored vehicles, supplies for the Southern Transitional Council, a separatist group backed by Abu Dhabi that seeks self-rule in southern Yemen. The STC had just declared control over the south, including the key city of Aden. In early December 2025, STC-affiliated groups had been involved in fighting in the Hadramaut region, with 32 people killed and 45 wounded in a single incident. Saudi Arabia had been backing the internationally recognized government of Yemen, supporting Yemeni unity and a unified state aligned with Riyadh. The UAE had taken a very different path. It quietly backed the STC for years, building up southern forces that the UAE saw as reliable, pragmatic partners against Iranian-backed Houthis in the north. When Saudi Arabia struck those ships, it was not just a military operation. It was a declaration sent in the most direct language possible. Abu Dhabi, you have crossed a line on our border. The UAE withdrew its remaining forces from Yemen shortly afterward. Abu Dhabi denied the cargo contained weapons and called the airstrike unjustified. But the damage was done. The most visible public split between the two countries in decades had arrived, not through a press release, but through fire over a port in southern Yemen. Analysts at Rystad Energy said what everyone was thinking. Right now, oil markets are being driven less by supply-demand fundamentals and more by political uncertainty. But here's the thing that the financial press missed in its coverage of these events. The Yemen confrontation and the oil production strategy are not two separate stories. They are the same story, expressed in two different languages. In Yemen, Saudi Arabia is saying to the UAE, "You do not get to control the strategic ports on our border. The Makalla port, the Aden coast, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, these are not just Yemeni geography. They are the corridor through which Saudi Arabia's trade and security interests flow into the Red Sea and toward the global market. The UAE's backing of the STC is, from Riyadh's perspective, Abu Dhabi planting a flag on Saudi Arabia's front lawn and calling it humanitarian work." Both messages carry the same core content. There is a new Saudi Arabia, one that is no longer content to be the great power that tolerates its smaller neighbors' growing influence, one that is willing to accept short-term financial pain to assert long-term dominance. MBS is playing a longer game than the budget spreadsheet suggests, and the UAE, for the first time in its history, is finding itself on the defensive. Now let's look at where this all leads. Because this is where it gets truly significant for the global economy, not just for two Gulf monarchies. The UAE's response to Saudi pressure has been strategic and accelerating. Dubai announced a plan to double its economy by 2033. It attracted $45.6 billion in foreign direct investment in 2024 alone. It accelerated its own infrastructure projects. Abu Dhabi is building data centers, artificial intelligence partnerships, and expanding ADNOC's global reach. The UAE is not folding, but the structural math is shifting underneath them. In 2021, Saudi Arabia hosted less than 5% of regional multinational headquarters. The UAE hosted 76%. By 2025, Saudi Arabia had already lured 675 companies to Riyadh. The trajectory is unmistakable. Where growth once automatically capitalized in Dubai, it now faces a fundamental split, and increasingly, Riyadh is capturing the better half of that split. At the same time, OPEC Plus itself, the framework that holds both Saudi Arabia and the UAE together in a shared production strategy, is under its deepest stress in years. The group is facing multiple crises simultaneously. Russian oil exports are falling due to U.S. sanctions over the Ukraine war. Iran is under pressure. Venezuelan oil supply is in turmoil after the United States captured President Nicolas Maduro in January 2026. And within the 8-member core of OPEC Plus, the Saudi-UAE public rift over Yemen has inserted political tension directly into what is supposed to be a purely economic coordination mechanism. In November 2025, OPEC Plus agreed to pause production increases for the first quarter of 2026, citing seasonal demand weakness. The February 4, 2026 meeting is the next critical date. The question facing every oil market analyst right now is whether the Saudi-UAE confrontation will begin to bleed into production policy, and whether the discipline that has kept OPEC Plus functional through decades of wars, sanctions, and price crashes will survive the most complicated relationship in its history. History offers some cautious reassurance. But analysts who cover the Gulf closely say this moment feels different, because the Saudi-UAE rivalry is not a temporary political dispute. It is a structural realignment. Two countries with competing visions of who leads the Gulf, who dominates the economy, and who controls the geography of the region's future. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, warned in late 2025 that the first quarter of 2026 would see one of the largest oil oversupply situations in recent years. The world is producing more oil than it is consuming. Brent crude was sitting at around $61 a barrel by the end of December 2025, about $30 below what Saudi Arabia needs to balance its budget. And yet, Saudi Arabia keeps pumping. That is the central paradox of this oil war. The country that needs high oil prices the most is the country choosing to destroy high oil prices. It is a sacrifice, and it is calibrated. Saudi Arabia's true production cost is just $10 per barrel. Even at $60, there is a $50 margin on every barrel sold. The kingdom is losing budget revenue, yes. It is running deficits, yes, but it is not losing money on the oil itself. Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure is almost entirely land-based and pipeline-connected. It can move oil quickly, cheaply, and at massive volume without much exposure to choke points. The UAE, by contrast, relies heavily on its maritime routes, through the Strait of Hormuz, through Bab al-Mandeb, through the ports that give Abu Dhabi and Dubai their commercial identity. When Saudi Arabia backs forces in Yemen that block or complicate those sea lanes, even indirectly, it is applying geographic pressure on the UAE's most fundamental physical vulnerability. The UAE moved much of its oil pipeline capacity inland specifically to avoid Hormuz dependence, building the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline to export oil from the eastern coast without going through the strait. But its commercial identity, the ports, the logistics, the shipping, remains deeply maritime. And Yemen's coast, where Saudi and UAE proxies are now openly fighting each other, runs directly along those maritime routes. This is why the geography of this oil war matters. It is not just about price charts and production quotas. It is about who controls the water, who controls the land, and who controls the business environment in which the next generation of Gulf wealth will be created. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UAE has deep historical roots, and those roots have always had thorns in them. In the 1950s, the two sides fought over the Bahraini Oasis, a border dispute that turned into armed clashes. After the UAE gained independence in 1971, Saudi Arabia withheld recognition over continued border disagreements and disputes over oil fields. These were only resolved in 1974 with the Treaty of Jeddah, which finally delineated borders and gave Saudi Arabia access to key territories, including the Sheba oil field, a field that today produces over 1 million barrels per day. Even that settlement, which looked like peace, contained the seeds of today's rivalry. The geographic boundaries drawn in 1974 gave Saudi Arabia oil wealth along the UAE border that Abu Dhabi still considers to have been taken. The memory of those disputes sits quietly in the background of every OPEC Plus meeting, every business hub competition, and every conversation between MBS and MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the UAE's president. OPEC Plus held its most recent meeting on January 4, 2026. Despite the dramatic Saudi-UAE confrontation over Yemen, despite the falling oil prices, despite the widening budget deficits, the group confirmed it would hold production steady through the first quarter of 2026. No dramatic escalation. Because the forces pulling Saudi Arabia and the UAE apart are not seasonal, they are structural. Two countries competing for the same multinational headquarters, the same Asian oil customers, the same regional mediator role on the world stage, the same claim to be the Gulf's most powerful voice. And now, fighting proxy wars over the same Yemeni coastline that determines who controls the sea lanes connecting the Gulf to the world. The next OPEC Plus meeting is February 1st, 2026. The next production decision will come shortly after. And every barrel that flows through the Strait of Hormuz, every company that decides whether to plant its regional headquarters in Riyadh or Dubai, and every weapons shipment that arrives or doesn't arrive at a southern Yemeni port will be a data point in the most consequential rivalry in the modern Gulf. This is not just a story about oil. It is a story about two countries standing at the crossroads of their own futures and discovering that the road they both want leads through the same narrow canyon. Saudi Arabia has a budget that bleeds at $60 oil. It has a Vision 2030 plan that costs hundreds of billions of dollars to execute. It has a crown prince who has staked his personal legacy on transforming a kingdom built on oil into something that can survive beyond oil. All of that creates pressure, enormous, crushing, real pressure. And yet Saudi Arabia is the one pumping more oil and crashing the price. That is the paradox at the heart of this oil war, and the answer to the paradox is the same as the answer to every great strategic gamble in history. The one who can afford to bleed longer wins. Saudi Arabia believes it can afford to bleed longer than the UAE. It believes that at $60 oil, the UAE's business hub advantage starts to crack because Gulf countries with lower revenues have less money to spend with Emirati banks, less capacity to invest through Dubai's financial infrastructure, less need for Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth expertise. Saudi Arabia believes that the pain it is absorbing now is an investment in a future where the Gulf's economic gravity lives permanently in Riyadh, not Dubai. Whether that calculation is right or wrong, it is the calculation being made. And the oil being pumped, the prices being destroyed, the airstrikes over Yemeni ports, the corporate headquarters being pulled to Riyadh, all of it is part of the same single, sweeping, geographic ambition. Saudi Arabia is not just flooding the market with oil. It is flooding the future, with its own presence, its own rules, and its own vision of who owns the Gulf. And the UAE, for the first time in a generation, is being asked a question it has never had to answer before. What do you do when your biggest neighbor decides it is done letting you lead? That question does not have an easy answer, and the oil war it has triggered, quiet, slow, expensive, and deeply geographic, is only just beginning.